Hello, everyone. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Programme here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. For those of you who don't know us already, the Quincy is a quite new think tank in Washington, dedicated to the principle of restraint in US foreign policy, the avoidance of further military adventures and interventions whenever possible, and the maintenance, when possible, of peace and cooperation in international affairs. Before I begin our talk for today, I'd just like to flag some upcoming talks. Next week, on Tuesday the 13th, we have a webinar on the ambiguous, shall we say, sources of funding for US think tanks. And then on Wednesday of next week, sorry, Tuesday the 18th, Wednesday the 19th, I will be discussing the Ukraine war and Europe's role with the French conservative politician and thinker Pierre Lelouch. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Nathan Robinson, the founding editor and editor-in-chief of Current Affairs, and a leading thinker on the left in the United States and Britain, from where we both come originally. And Nathan, who is the co-author with Noam Chomsky, who will need no introduction for you, of the new book, The Myth of American Idealism, How US Foreign Policy Endangers the World. So Nathan, welcome. I think you may still be muted.
There we go. Anatol, nice to be with you. Nice to be with everyone here at Quincy.
Thanks a lot. So I thought to begin with, could you perhaps just describe the book, which I will now show, and of course back to front.
There we go.
That's it. And describe the book and its main theses.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you mentioned, this is a book that is co-authored with the great Professor Noam Chomsky, who deep privilege of my life to be able to collaborate with this on him. And just to give the backstory of why this book exists, he had been such a major influence on my thinking early in my life, and a lot of Current Affairs magazine is very much Chomsky influenced in this kind of deep forensic exposés of propaganda and myth from a roughly democratic socialist or libertarian socialist perspective. And when we founded the magazine, we were quite honored that he became a subscriber early on, and he would email me whenever his magazine didn't show up, which since we were kind of a ropey operation was frequently, and we struck up a correspondence, and I interviewed him a couple of times, and eventually I came to feel like we needed an updated version of Chomsky's arguments for our time, right? The last major book that he'd put out that was not just a collection of interviews was in maybe 2000, well, 2000. I mean, it was a while ago, and so I have always felt that his commentary, his argument, exposing the ways that U.S. power is used, and then the arguments that are used to justify those uses of U.S. power, and exposing the hollowness of those arguments. I've always felt that was so vital in training people in critical thinking. But of course, there are so many issues that arise in our time that that aren't covered in his books in 2006, or the best collection of his work was Understanding Power, which is from 1992. So I wanted to collect some of his commentaries on climate change, on the war in Ukraine, on the Israel-Palestine conflict up until that point, and importantly, we were writing this in 2022, and to really kind of condense a lot of his sprawling opus into a powerful, new, succinct summary of his argument. And, in doing that, in putting that book together, we had to sort of think through, well, what is the core of Chomsky's argument, right? A lot of times he has written about particular conflicts, right? He writes about the war in Iraq, or he writes about the war in Afghanistan. But what is the thread that runs through a lot of his writing? And as we sort of collected, as we went over, his vast body of work, this core came out of exposing the myth of American idealism. That is to say, the way in which U.S. presidents in particular, but policymakers, intellectuals, the press, have tended to push the idea that what is in fact the naked use of an expansion of power is in fact done for idealistic, pure, benevolent, and selfless reasons. And so whether it's the war in Vietnam, whether it's the invasion of Iraq, whether it's United States support for Israel, all of it is cloaked in the idea that we are not like other states. We are not a mafia state. We do not pursue our self-interest. We pursue the interest of all humankind. We operate on, and we compile a lot of this this rhetoric about how angelic and wonderful and unique and distinctive the United States is. And then examining that myth, and then looking very, very deeply at the actual facts of what happened. One of the things that Chomsky argues is that all of this is often spoken without any clear examination of, well, what actually happened to people, real people in the real world. And so a lot of what he does is endless compiling of, well, these are the actual facts. This is the bloodshed. This is the stuff we won't look at. And so a lot of this book is devoted to going through these conflicts and bringing out what was not looked at by the U.S. press and what was not seen by Americans.
Yes, I find this tremendously valuable, particularly, of course, now being someone of a certain age. And, I do remember from the last couple of decades of the Cold War, how often we were lied to and lied to ourselves about particular episodes. I've just been reading Seymour Hersh again on the My Lai cover-up and the failure to hold people to account for that. And this is then briefly acknowledged, but it's then swept under the carpet, which means that people don't learn from it and are therefore willing to be deceived again when it comes to the same kind of lies or self-deceits today. It's a remarkable syndrome, I find. The most recently, of course, Iraq, which is not Cold War. It's easily within our memories. Now generally acknowledged to have been a disaster, but no real examination of why and how this was successfully sold to so much of the American public and the American media.
Yeah, there's a couple important points there in what you say. Learning, one of the reasons why I thought it was so important to go back and dredge up even Chomsky's writings on the Vietnam War is because, as you say, the lessons aren't learned, and so you see the same scenario play out over and over and over again. In fact, I heard Senator John Fetterman, when he talked about the Vietnam War, said it was a war to defend it was one of these wars where we defended democracy. And I just thought, oh, you don't really know anything about what the war was, do you? You don't actually know. I'm sure he sincerely does believe that because he doesn't know anything about the Vietnam War. You mentioned the My Lai massacre. Now, interestingly, the way that is sort of incorporated into the American mythology is I've seen apologists for the Vietnam War say, well, the My Lai massacre is actually proof of American goodness and values because we exposed it, investigated it. We are ashamed of it, and so the very fact that we look back on this massacre as a horrible atrocity, an aberration, shows that the war as a whole was a war that we were, that was conducted on principle. Now, what Chomsky's argument, in fact, is that the My Lai massacre does serve that function, and what he points out is that there's this whole body of massacre that dwarfs the My Lai massacre in its scope, namely the bombing of South Vietnam, that is essentially excluded from the story of the Vietnam War. There's talk about the bombing of North Vietnam, there's talk about things like the My Lai massacre, but the massive bombing campaign in South Vietnam, which doesn't really fit into the story because bombing the South Vietnamese doesn't fall into our understanding of what we were doing in Vietnam. Chomsky points out that this is just excluded from the story. It's not mentioned. It's not even really studied very much. We don't know the casualties. We don't know the damage. It's really extraordinary that a huge piece, or the bombing of Laos, which is just totally undiscussed, even though I think it was the most bombed country since World War II. I mean, it's unexploded U.S. ordnance is still killing people in Laos today.
Unless Gaza is a country.
Maybe. Oh yeah, Gaza. Well, yeah. So, but left out of the story completely. I mean, I was never taught about it in American schools. I was taught a little bit about the Vietnam War, but I think it proves that Chomsky is essentially right, that when you start looking, you realize that there are these hugely consequential events or massively important facts about U.S. wars that just sort of disappear from view.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we have some questions from the audience about this. I mean, in recent times, there have been two developments.
See. I think it's Anatol rather than me who's been lost, right? Just want to make sure that I haven't disappeared on the bad New Orleans Wi-Fi. Um, but okay. Let's see. If yeah, so if Anatol's well, as we wait for Anatol to come back, I'll just read this question for Jason. In contemplating your chapter on the domestic roots of U.S. foreign policy, in mere weeks we're seeing a refutation of supposed core American ideals in the administration's foreign policy. Do you see this as a continuity in policy that is no longer shrouded in propaganda and mythology? I'm curious as to your view on Trumpism. In fact, Anatol and I have been talking about this. So the it's been rather interesting for me as a writer on foreign policy from a critical perspective, as someone who spends a lot of time trying to prove that essentially the justifications that are used by, for example, the Biden administration are false, right? That our supposed care and compassion for countries around the world is actually cloaking the naked use of power in ways that are harmful. And And then, and then we get someone like Donald Trump who comes out and just starts talking in openly imperial terms, who basically doesn't bother to put the humanitarian gloss on the policies, which is quite extraordinary. He was recently asked uh, when he debuted his ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza. One of the most extraordinary moments was he was asked. He said, "We're going to take it over. We're going to hold it. It's going to be ours." Or he even said at one point, "It's going to be mine." And a journalist actually thought to ask him, "Well, under what authority would you take Gaza?" And Trump's answer was, "Under U.S. authority." And so, not even attempting to make an argument that there is any legality to just taking Gaza. In fact, now you see, I read regularly the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal because you have to know your enemy, and they've switched to arguments like, well, Trump understands that national sovereignty isn't everything. Trump understands that international law, that's just a sham, and power is what matters, and the U.S. has to do what's in its interests, no matter, an international law, that's just a scrap of paper, or that's just or the UN is controlled by China and Russia. We can't pay any attention to what the UN says. And it's strange because in a way, it feels like our book has dated within since October when we published it. And when we published it, we were making all these arguments. Well, the U.S. flagrantly violates international law. It doesn't care about what international law says. Look, here's the UN Charter, and here's all the ways in which United States action violates it. And then Trump's rhetoric is sort of, I know and I don't care. And a strange sort of thing. I've been thinking a lot about the phrase hypocrisy is the tribute the device pays to virtue, meaning, when you have a hypocrite, at least they're acknowledging the rules, even as they violate them. They're saying they are affirming that these are the standards to which we should conform, but then they violate them. And it's really quite disturbing when someone comes along and is almost more honest than the hypocrite and says, "You're right. I'm not a hypocrite. I just don't believe in any standards other than my own pursuit of wealth and power, and I'm quite direct about that." That's been disturbing. So yes, I do think Trumpism marks a break, somewhat increase in honesty, but there's something very chilling about the abandonment of any pretense that we care about values. I think we have Anatol back.
Yes, so sorry about that. The entire neighborhood has gone dark.
Oh no!
So something must have happened. I'm sorry about that. I gather that you've got onto the question about Trump abandoning the myth.
Yeah. Yes, and in your absence, I decided to start answering this because it is totally fascinating. I think it's one of the main things you and I wanted to talk about.
Yes. But do you think, where does that leave us in a sense? Because, to a degree, our criticisms of American imperialism have been helped by the fact that we could hold up this contrast to what America, or the American establishment said that it was doing. But if, in fact, the newly dominant American establishment doesn't pretend to be anything other than nakedly self-interested and imperialist, what do we say?
Yeah. I was just, but I don't know if you heard, but just before you got on, I was talking about the phrase hypocrisy is the tribute the device pays to virtue, and how chilling it has been for me as someone who, I feel kind of blindsided because I'm always doing this. Well, these are the values, these are the laws, and these are the ways in which we're violating the laws. And when Trump comes out and just says, yes, I don't care about those laws. The civil rights movement, obviously, part of its rhetorical success came from the fact that it was able to point out the hypocrisy, the inconsistency between all men are created equal and actual American practice, and was able to make the kind of rhetorical move, which is to say, okay, we've affirmed this Constitution, we've affirmed the Declaration of Independence, these are the values, we are all committed to these as an absolute, so these are non-negotiable. Okay, well, given that these are non-negotiable, now we have our argument on the basis of, is what is actually happening consistent with the things that we've already agreed are the non-negotiables? And so that's extremely, extremely helpful, because if that's the game that is being played, then the civil rights movement, it's very difficult to make an argument against the claims of the civil rights movement, because there is such obvious inconsistency. And I think that Chomsky's arguments are so powerful, in fact, because once you see the facts, you say, well, okay, well, yes, it's clear that the US is violating the UN Charter and pretending that it's not. It's clear that what Israel is doing is in violation of international law. It's very clear that the United States is violating its own laws against providing weapons to human rights abusers by continuing the weapons flow to Israel. How do you operate? How do you make arguments, as you say, when it shifts and those claims, those moral claims aren't really made as well? I mean, you can argue, I mean, Trump said, he said the Gazans would like to leave. He said they'll be better off. They will be happier. And I can't imagine that any of them won't want to leave. Now, you can point out that that is obviously not true. But it's very clear that he doesn't care very much what they think, that he sees it as a real estate deal, that he claims that his authority is the fact that America is powerful. But I think, so you're left going, well, okay, well, now I need to make the case for the basic values. Now I need to make the case for why it is good to be a good person, why it is good to care whether other people live or die. I feel somewhat on solid ground there, because I think most people are not sociopaths. So I think we can make the case. Actually, it gets us to the point where we say, okay, well, let's make the case for why international law is important, for why cooperation is important, for why this kind of dog eat dog, might makes right worldview is going to lead the world into a complete catastrophe. So it doesn't leave you completely bereft of the ability to make appeals and arguments. It just means we have to shift to, I think, pointing out the dangers and the horror of that kind of worldview.
Do you see a new opportunity for the Democratic Party in this? Or, I mean, because before Trump came back, of course, there was the example of Gaza under a Democratic administration, which, I mean, perhaps this was not surprising given, the record of some previous Democratic administrations, but this was a particularly, egregious and obvious violation of everything that the Democratic Party in particular had claimed to stand for in international affairs. Is there any coming back from this as far as the Democrats are concerned, do you think?
Well, it's difficult for me to say. I've tried to hesitate to make predictions about how U.S. politics could go, since so many surprising things happen. I tend to think there is an opening for the left that Trump creates, because I was arguing this in Current Affairs in 2016, that in fact Trump's campaign was an opportunity for a Bernie Sanders presidency, that he would have been the most effective candidate against Trump, because this kind of populist message, Trump sort of nicely exposes the sociopathy of and greed of the billionaire class. I mean, he's a cartoon billionaire. You couldn't want anyone better to run against. So in many ways, Trump does create an opportunity for an opposition, because you can go, okay, are you a person who cares about other people? Are you a person who has values? Are you a person who doesn't want public services destroyed and your government pillaged by people who don't care whether you live or die. Well, come with us. But I do think that the Democratic Party doesn't have an opportunity unless it sheds the hypocrisy that we've been talking about. Because one of the things that Trump does so well is expose that hypocrisy. That's one of the chief sources of his political appeal, is his ability to say, look, all of these liberals who claim to believe in these things, they don't really believe in them. And war is a real clear example of that. I published an article during the campaign called "What Trump Understands About War." Trump understands that Americans, especially since Iraq, are kind of instinctively skeptical of war. They don't want to send their kids to die in wars. And so Trump positioned himself as the pro-peace candidate and said, all of the Democrats are pro-war. They're pro-neocon. They are the allies of Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney. And the Democrats fed right into this by putting Liz Cheney on stage with them and saying, that she is our example of principle and integrity. And Trump comes back and says, well, that's not principle and integrity. That's someone who destroyed a country. And that's quite effective because it happens to be true. So I think unless they shed the hypocrisy, unless we, really get back to sincere commitment to core values, then there is still such an opportunity for someone like Trump to come along and do a kind of bastardized Chomsky. Like, that's kind of what you see often on the right. Like, on the right, you have criticisms of the Ukraine war and the war in Iraq that sound a little bit Chomskyan.
But hello, you still there?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, this connection is very bad. I wrote a book, about this myself 20 years ago, which made me very unpopular, called America, Right or Wrong, in which I talked about the contrast between, of course, Trump wasn't around then, it's been given different names, Jacksonian nationalism. I called it the American nationalist antithesis, but pointed out that the ideology of somebody like, Hillary Clinton, for example, in 2016, but also Joe Biden, was also nationalist, but civic nationalist. But this belief in American goodness and idealism and, America's role in leading the world toward, freedom and democracy, is that so deeply rooted in American nationalism that, as after Vietnam, in fact, this cannot be abolished, that the gods, if you like, will always be put back on their pedestal. There will always be a Reagan to come along and tell everybody, don't worry, everything's fine. America is still what it always was.
Well, again, I don't know. It's hard to say how deeply rooted these sentiments are, how easy to overcome they are. The way that we approach this in the Myth of American Idealism is to try and draw a distinction between the American people and the actions of the American state and say, essentially, you don't need to see the actions of the state as part of your identity as Americans. These are, in fact, the claims that are made by people like Reagan, that they are the embodiment of the spirit of the country, are false, that these people represent a narrow elite sector that is pursuing its self-interest, and that you should see that, and you shouldn't take that to be your definition of your own country. And so what we do in the final chapter of the book is profile activist movements that we feel over the course of American history that we feel have an equal claim to represent the spirit of the rambunctious and rebellious spirit of the American people. In fact, this is the central criticism of Chomsky has always been, oh, he's anti-American. And it's a complete misunderstanding. And I think it's really important if we are going to forge something different that has widespread popularity among Americans. It is quite important to say this is not an attack on America right? This is an expose of the crimes of American elites and the American state. And in fact, the country, the United States, has a lot of people to be proud of, a lot of movements to be proud of, a lot of accomplishments to be proud of. So you don't have to abandon all. I mean, I'm a critic of nationalism generally, but you don't have to abandon all kind of patriotic pride in your country in order to shed the view that the actions of United States presidents are, represent the core of our values.
I mean, my view, and both for America and Britain, but I think I can speak here for the Quincy Institute as well, is that and that's why we're named after John Quincy Adams and his, famous speech about this, that America needs to return to an exemplary rather than an activist version of nationalism. That the way to spread American values in the world is by perfecting, well, nothing is ever perfect, but improving the example of America and Western democracy in general at home. And I must say, I always found it odd. I mean, during the Bush administration, for example, the number of American progressives who were bitterly hostile to Bush, totally recognized the hypocrisies and lies involved, but then still asserted America's right to condemn other countries on the world stage and spread American values through American power, despite the fact that they themselves thought that the current American administration was profoundly hostile to those values. I always found that very strange. I suppose that is nationalism, basically.
I guess it is. I mean, I don't find it that's. I mean, it's very easy to be to be sort of taken in by propaganda or to. I mean, you have to remember, Anatol. I went to American schools. You didn't go to American schools, and you don't get taught anything about the world. So you have to remember, Americans don't actually know anything about the world around them, right? They don't see the world around them. They only know what they are told by, first off, if you read a newspaper, you might know what's in the newspaper. You know a few facts here and there, but there's such a. It is very, very difficult to come to understand the world as it is. But on I think that idea of the exemplary role is quite good. We recently got sent a fascinating little book called The Dean of Shandong by I think he's an American or Canadian professor who went to teach in China, and he's talking about the Chinese versus American political systems, and he's like, well, the Chinese political system, people criticize it, but he's like, but it functions. He's like, the country functions. Look, they can do all this stuff, and he's quite a defender of the Chinese political system because he says, well, look at the outcomes, and I think it's very difficult. I always think if I got into an argument about political systems with a person from China, and they pulled the card that said, but your country doesn't work. I would find it very, very difficult to make a spirited case for democracy in response to the argument, but you can't build a train, right? You can't build anything. You can't do anything. Your country is tearing itself apart at the seams. You all hate each other. Convince me that this is a better system that we should adopt.
I mean, the Cold War, of course, made that so much easier because, I mean, there was never any doubt that with all its faults, the United States and the Western democracies worked better than the Soviet Union. And the Berlin Wall was not built to keep West Germany from invading East Germany. It was built to prevent East Germans escaping to the West. So in that sense, we only had to run faster than the Soviet Union, which in a way, given what a dreadful system that was not difficult. Now it is more difficult, right?
Yeah. Well, it may have been, I guess there might have been a period in 1959, 58, 59, where that was in doubt, where Sputnik went up and we got a little terrified that maybe they had a better system. But they promised to bury us. I think we have to, I agree with you completely that like the first you have to clean your own house. Jordan Peterson has this of like clean your room, and then someone posted a picture of him in his room, and it's completely filthy and a total mess. And I feel like my advice to Jordan Peterson would be the same as my advice to the United States of America, which is before we start preaching sermons on virtue. In fact, we saw right that. One of the main arguments that was made in the Soviet Union was, but what about lynchings? Right? You're hypocrites. And in fact, we would have had a much stronger case. We would have had a much stronger anti-communist case if we hadn't been a deeply, deeply racist and hypocritical country at the time. And it's really important that if you want anyone to take seriously your sermons on human rights, if you want to be able to use international law, and I think we should, right? I'm a believer in international institutions and international law. But if you want to make appeals to those things, you really have to make sure that anyone who disagrees with you can't immediately say, but it's so obvious that you don't care about any of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. So where do you think we go from here?
That's a question I've been struggling with a little bit because Trump's election. The first time Trump was elected, it was very galvanizing. So it was galvanizing to independent left media. We saw a flood of subscriptions. It was galvanizing to the Democratic Socialists of America. And when Bernie Sanders was running for election in this country, it was kind of obvious we didn't really have to ask these where do we go from here questions because leftists had a kind of answer, which is, well, the first thing we need to do is we need to get Bernie Sanders to be president, right? We had something to sort of orient ourselves around, and that made it easy. Now it's not easy. It's not been a galvanizing moment yet in the same way. It might be different when the sort of consequences of Trump's actions start to really hit people hard and hurt people. But so far, we haven't seen the kind of street protests that we saw in the first Trump administration. And so for those of us who are deeply horrified and who understand that climate change doesn't stop happening just because you eliminate all references to it from government documents, and who see the ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza and think, well, we have to, stop this. This is one of the worst atrocities of our time. The answer, where do we go from here? What do we do? Is one that's a real head scratcher. I think the goal here is quite clear, which is to build an authentic, sincere, non-hypocritical, social democratic politics in the United States of America. That's the goal, right? The goal is to build a movement that actually cares about democracy and human rights, that does not use these as rhetorical fig leaves for the pursuit of our own power, that is an effective and appealing opposition to everything that is represented by Trump and the right, and also to everything that is represented by people like Hillary Clinton, who can preach the sermons about their commitment to international institutions and then are best friends with Henry Kissinger.
Yeah. And of course, the thing is that an America like that would be far more appealing to people around the world than America as it has presented itself, for the past generation and much longer.
Just this week I interviewed Dr. Omar Suleiman, who's a leading American Islamic scholar and activist, and he said he'd just been traveling around the world to lots of different Muslim countries, and he said, I have never seen the level of hatred for the United States that I see right now. And he said it's really critically important that I go as a representative of the United States and show them that we're not all apologists for genocide. He said, the U.S. support for Israel really inflaming people's detestation of the United States. And we know that Trump is going to obviously make partnership with China a much, who are reliable and don't threaten their friends, and a much more appealing prospect than partnership with the volatile, greedy, and violent United States of America.
Yeah. But on the other hand, of course, it looks as if Trump may do something which the last administration was totally unwilling to do, which is bring peace to Ukraine.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, right. Well, that's right. That's just been in the news this week. Trump actually had a conversation with Putin and actually appears to be initiating negotiations to end the war, which, obviously Chomsky had been saying for years, why isn't the Biden administration willing to sit down and negotiate with Putin? And their unwillingness to have normal diplomatic dialogue on these things has been, has guaranteed that the war will continue. I mean, this is another example of how the failures of the Democrats and of American liberalism create an opening for a right wing that is not sincerely anti or on principle against violence and war and for human rights. I mean, they're just as likely to drive us into a war with China as they are to end the war in Ukraine. But because Donald Trump understands that Americans will reward in popular opinion a president who brings a horrific war in Ukraine to a close, he understands that would be a major coup for him, and he has the good political sense to want to do something that is extremely obviously the correct thing to do.
Multiple ironies. Well, Nathan, thank you so much. I'm afraid that we have to end here,
Okay.
but I'm most grateful for an extremely interesting conversation, and I hope that a great many people read your book and learn from it.